Everyone. Thank you for joining us for a special webinar honoring the remarkable legacy of late Professor Alexander Galetovic, whose dedication to public policies continue to inspire us. Today, we delve into the critical realm of work, an area deeply influenced by public policy decisions. Just last week, discussions were sparked by the Secretary of Labor's stance on wage increases through employer generosity. This contrasts sharply with the economic perspective that wages should reflect productivity gains. So we have two different formulas in a way to increase wages. Amidst this debate, we are honored to have Professor Elizabeth Anderson, the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan, recognized for her groundbreaking work with a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant in 2019. Professor Anderson's book, Hijacked, challenges to reevaluate the work ethic governing labor regulations and policies. She navigates the history and evolution of work ethics, providing us insights into its potential transformation. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Anderson to share her thoughts. You have about 30 minutes, and then we have Danielle who will provide some comments for about 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. Some of us might want to write the questions in Spanish, even if you want me to translate it, and some of you might want to raise your hand and I might give you the voice. So thank you, Elizabeth, for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be speaking to you today. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Protestant work ethic at its origins in 17th century England and connected to today's version of capitalism known as neoliberalism, which focuses on the interests of shareholders in corporations and the purported duty of corporations to maximize profits on behalf of shareholders. This is following on my book, Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back, which just came out. We can start thinking about the Protestant work ethic by looking at the greatest scholar of the work ethic, Max Weber, who wrote The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The English translation came out in 1920. According to Weber, the Puritans of the 17th century created an ideology of the work ethic that ended up rationalizing the capitalist exploitation of workers' willingness to work in the name of maximizing profits by any legal means. The original Puritans who invented the work ethic were not focused on material gains, but that's what the work ethic ended up turning into as it secularized over time. Weber famously declared in the Protestant Ethic that the Puritan wanted to work at a calling, we are forced to do so. That is, that the Puritans, driven by theological goals, the desire for assurance of salvation, wanted to work hard on that account, whereas we today, as workers, are trapped in a capitalist system where we don't have any option but to work as tireless drudges. I think in order to assess Max Weber's view of the work ethic, it's worth going back to the origins. Weber himself cites Richard Baxter, who lived from 1615 to 1691. He was a famous Puritan theologian in England at the time. And Baxter is probably the greatest theorist of the work ethic in this era. But what did he really mean originally? Well, he specified that we have a set of duties, everyone. Number one, to engage in disciplined work in a calling. A calling is a specialized occupation to which God has called one to serve. No one is allowed to waste any time in idleness. We have to use every moment of time productively. We're also not allowed to waste any material goods or the natural resources of the earth, because God gave the earth to human beings to use to promote the welfare of our fellow human beings. And to waste any natural resources then is to go against God's will. The Puritans were the killjoys of the 17th century. They didn't believe in fun or pleasure. They believed in asceticism, partly out of a concern that people don't indulge in vanities such as conspicuous consumption and luxury. And hence they also thought that covetousness was a sin, where they defined covetousness not just as wanting what your neighbor has, but as wanting anything more than what one needs to perform one's duties to our fellow human beings, namely to promote their welfare. But finally, the Puritans argued that every man should get and save as much money as he can. That might seem to go in conflict with the idea that you shouldn't want more material goods than you need to do your duty. But in getting as much as you can and saving it, you are in fact required to put that money to good use, not on yourself, but in acts of effective altruism. Baxter actually was the original inventor of the doctrine of effective altruism. From Baxter's point of view, all of these duties are needed to be performed in order for individuals to gain certainty of their own salvation. Baxter is a Calvinist. He believes that God has predestined us to heaven or hell. We have no idea whether we are saved or damned, but we are able to infer whether God has saved us by observing our own behavior and following the requirements of the work ethic, especially working very, very hard, is the best sign that one could have that one is graced by God with salvation. I want to stress against Max Weber's view, his reading of the work ethic, that I think he was very one-sided in stressing only the downsides for individuals of the work ethic. If you read Baxter closely, he actually had a very sophisticated business ethic, which prescribed duties on the rich. And he also offered some uplifting thoughts for ordinary workers. Not just Baxter, but another important Puritan theologian, Robert Sanderson, stressed that the duty to find one's calling is actually a duty to follow one's conscience, which yields a right to free occupational choice. Sanderson stressed that one of the criteria for determining what calling or specialized occupation God has called one to serve in is whether you can get up enough enthusiasm about performing this work that you could dedicate your career, your working life to that occupation. And that's a subjective determination. Whether you are enthusiastic about one job or another makes a big difference to your choices. Other people can't tell you what those choices have to be. You have to find it in yourself, in your own personal passions. So in a certain sense, the work ethic is a kind of liberation for workers. They can't be forced into any given occupation by some outside person. They can't be expected automatically to follow in their father's footsteps. They're free to choose their own job. Puritans also stressed the dignity of all workers, whether large or small. Even the most menial of workers do God's work. This is stressed again and again. The fundamental equality of occupations from God's point of view is a deep theme of the work ethic. I note here the citation CD is to Richard Baxter's Christian Directory, which is his 5-volume comprehensive guide to living as a good Christian. Workers are also entitled to meaningful work, or what Baxter called honest labors profitable to the Commonwealth. What is meaningful work? It's work that's actually helpful to other human beings and to the society in which one lives. Baxter insisted that employees were entitled to relief from employer abuses. Employers are not allowed to rule their employees tyrannically. Employees are entitled to safe and healthful conditions. They're entitled to fair wages and living wages. And if they are too poor to support themselves by their own labor alone, they have a right to charity. That's a right. They can claim it as a right. And finally, although workers were not allowed to take long vacations here on Earth because they were not allowed to waste any time in idleness, once they were saved, they would enjoy the saints' everlasting rest. They would have an eternal vacation in heaven, in communion with God. And finally, Baxter insisted that the idle rich were sinners. They had to labor too. God, he says, hath strictly commanded labor to every last person, whether rich or poor. What happened with the work ethic over time is that it split into two versions of the work ethic due to the Industrial Revolution. Back in the 17th century, before the Industrial Revolution, the model workers in England at the time were yeoman farmers and craftsmen. The distinctive feature of these two types of workers, who were together the vast majority of workers in England at the time, is that such workers actually had a property interest. The craftsman would own his own tools if he was a journeyman and own his own shop if he was a master craftsman. The yeoman farmer would either own his own land or have an extraordinarily long lease on his land, up to 99 years. So they're capital owners and manual workers at the same time. And that enabled the Puritans to combine the responsibilities and the benefits of the work ethic in the same person. So you work really hard and you will be making a lot of money. That's the general idea. For the model worker, that's how it worked. But the Industrial Revolution created a class division that was quite extreme between capitalists on the one hand and wage workers who are manual workers who don't have any capital assets at all, or any access to streams of capital income. So the Industrial Revolution ended up heightening class divisions, and hence they afforded the opportunity to capitalists to seize the work ethic and remake it in their own image and interests, dividing the costs and the benefits of all that hard work, putting the burdens on workers and taking the profits for themselves. That was not the original vision for the craftsman and the yeoman farmer. They would get profits from their assets from working hard. And hence, over time, the work ethic secularized and led to two distinct work ethics. And I'll call them conservative, which is basically the pro-capitalist work ethic that turned into neoliberalism in the 21st century, and the progressive work ethic, or the pro-worker work ethic. So on the conservative side, they insisted on that only the self-sufficient have dignity. The poor, if they're too poor to support themselves, are undeserving. Whereas the progressive said all workers are entitled to their dignity, and every particular person is also entitled to the satisfaction of his needs, even if unable to work. On the conservative side, we get shareholder capitalism, the idea that we should design policies to favor capital over labor. And on the progressive side, ultimately, the progressive work ethic turned into social democracy, and the general idea that public policy should favor equitable growth, or the growth of workers' wages in concert with increases in labor productivity. Conservatives tend to prefer private charity, or that is to take care of the poor through private charity rather than government benefits, or if the government is administering some kind of social welfare system for the poor, it should condition access to that welfare on recipients performing work. Whereas progressives, especially social democrats, favor universal social insurance, everybody getting benefits, old age pensions, universal health care, and to get those benefits unconditionally. Conservatives don't really believe that workers are entitled to free paid vacations. They have to earn any leisure or leaves. Whereas famously in the social democracies, we see maximum hours laws, guaranteed paid vacations, parental leave, and so forth. Conservatives conceive of the firm as essentially the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, that is, capitalists should rule over workers within the firm. Whereas on the progressive side, we see measures designed to enhance the autonomy of workers within the business enterprise, various alternative forms of enterprise, such as cooperatives, workers' cooperatives, or at least co-determination, and also supports for individuals who want to be self-employed. What has happened to the work ethic today? Well, in the United States and even across the world, capitalism has mostly been adopted the neoliberal form, which I argue is just the latest version of the conservative or capitalist version of the work ethic. So here we can see in the United States, since the early 1970s, wages have been relatively flat, even though productivity has risen. The gap between productivity and wages has largely been taken by an increasing share of income going to owners of capital assets, and also the leading executives of capitalist firms. Across the wealthier economies worldwide, we see the labor share of income declining since around 1980. And here I just obtained some data from Chile. And you can see here that the top 10% share of national income pre-tax is around 60% now. The top 1% in Chile gets around 25% of national income. That's the top 1% of all Chileans. Whereas the national income, the share of national income taken by the bottom half of the population has been declining since around 1950 or so, and now is considerably less than 10%. This is levels of inequality that are larger even than they are in the United States, although the United States also has very high inequality. Getting back to the US scene, we can see here that the direct compensation of chief executive officers of major firms has been galloping ahead to extreme levels, in line with the stock index. Now, many people argue that all of this is justified because the higher income workers are also working more hours. And this has been more true over time, as we can see in these graphs. I encourage you especially to look at men whose income is considerably higher than women. And you can see low-income workers are working fewer hours than the highest paid workers. Okay, so some people say, look, all that inequality is justified because look at how hard the highest income workers are working. They're spending many more hours at work. And in the United States, that is certainly true. At the very top reaches, you see billionaires such as Elon Musk, who is pretty much spending all of his waking hours at work. However, I want to push back against that by appealing to the original conception of the work ethic that the Puritans had. It's very important to distinguish between being very, very busy making money and actually engaging in productive labor. And the original Puritans who invented the work ethic stressed that distinction in their business ethic. So Richard Baxter condemned mere wealth extraction, business models that consist only in taking advantage of other people and making money that way. He called it a prison and a constant calamity to spending one's life doing little good at all to other people, even if he could grow rich by it himself. And he specifically singled out numerous types of unfair and exploitative business models that he called oppressive, for condemnation. He condemned treading on your brethren as stepping stones of your own advancement. You can't just climb over them. He condemned any actions that injured their inferiors, vulnerable people. He condemned monopolists, usurers, people who charge too much interest, hucksters, people are selling things that aren't really worth it. They're hyping the value of goods that are really not that valuable. And grocers, people are trying to make money by cornering the market in some good. He condemned landlords who would unfairly evict their tenants, or rack renters who charged excessive rents. John Locke, who was a follower of the work ethic, also condemned price discrimination, that is charging a higher price than you would otherwise be willing to accept just because you know that the buyer is poor or desperate. And from the perspective of this original work ethic, I think we can identify some contradictions of neoliberal shareholder capitalism, the regime that both the United States and Chile and many other capitalist countries around the world are living in today. Why should workers work so hard for the idle rich? The original Puritans didn't think that. They think if you are working hard, you are entitled to the benefits of all that hard work. The Puritans also condemned capitalists who were very busy, but pursuing business models that undermine other people's welfare. And there are many such business models in existence today that are making huge profits at other people's expense. We could consider purely wealth extractive business models, such as various private equity firms who degrade the quality of their products and still manage to make profits that they extract from everyone else. business models that exploit the vulnerable. In the United States, people can go to the emergency room and then get stuck with surprise medical bills vastly in excess of any reasonable fee because they're not told the price of healthcare in advance. And many Americans have lost their houses because they have signed predatory mortgages whose terms they didn't understand. Many firms in America profit by misleading people. There are many for-profit schools in the United States that have received enormous tuition funds purporting to train people in high technology jobs, software engineering, but they train them on old computers using obsolete programming languages. So after paying all that tuition, they can't find a job in the tech industry. We also have multi-level marketing, another kind of scam for which millions of Americans have fallen and lost all of their savings. We have business models where profits are made by shifting risks to vulnerable people. There are various techniques for corporations to cause their pension funds for their retiring workers to go bankrupt so that they can save themselves from the burdens of having to contribute to workers' pensions. And of course, we have corporations that are undermining the future habitability of the earth for future generations, notably fossil fuel companies. Social media also can be faulted for the ways it spreads hatred, propaganda, and anti-democratic behavior and ideas. And so I think there's a lot more to be said on behalf of the original Puritan work ethic than the version of the work ethic that we have inherited under contemporary neoliberal shareholder capitalism. But there's also a positive alternative for workers that was developed primarily in Europe, known as social democracy, which although today is on hard times, I think still has some promise for revival and helping the fortunes of workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting and great. Daniel, do you have a presentation or?
I'm sorry?
Daniel, do you have a presentation or just comments in general?
No, I don't have something to share on screen.
Okay.
So should I just get going?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Professor Anderson, for the talk and the book, which I've been asked to reflect on. And it's just, so much material, and I'll have to try to choose some of the most salient points to discuss here, though admittedly much more could be said. So this is, for those of you who haven't read it, it's intellectual history, but with a clear normative intent. It's searching and interpreting the past for what it can teach us regarding very present concerns. And in this, I thought it was a bit like Teresa Bejan's Mere Civility, which also goes back to some of Protestant thinkers to discuss another problem in this case, which is free speech. But I thought it kind of reminded me a little bit of it in terms of its strategy. This book traces the Protestant work ethic into many fields. We learn about how it informs philosophical doctrines like utilitarianism, political ideologies like liberalism, social democracy, and conservatism, and even its influence on social sciences, particularly on economics. So regarding this intellectual history contribution, I think that what I learned from it is as someone that self-identifies as a liberal and specifically as an egalitarian liberal, I found particularly fascinating how looking at this past from a Protestant ethic viewpoint helps illuminate why people who passionately identify as liberals have ended up some on the left and others on the right of the political spectrum. As this book shows, Locke, Smith, and Mill consistently argued against institutional and property arrangements that benefited the idle rich at the expense of the poor, and demanded that political and economic institutions benefited everyone. So after reading this book, I came out with a much stronger sense of the deep roots of the liberal egalitarian project, which may have been articulated and systematized by Rawls, but that is deeply inscribed in the political commitments of centuries of liberal thought. So I think in this sense, it supplies a firmer historical roots to the liberal egalitarian project broadly conceived. For those of us who were schooled in Rawls in undergrad, it's a very powerful contrast, I would say. I think this story of who is on each side between the progressives and conservatives, or right and left, is really instructive. Here, tracing this fight, between the progressives and conservative work ethics, suggests that the fundamental divide is not about markets, which is something I fully agree with, but which I think would be news to many in Chile, which I think tends to divide people on the right and left precisely according to their attitudes to markets. The book argues that this is not very informative, that this is actually about which specific market and institutional arrangements are put in place. There's no such thing as unregulated markets. They all have some sort of regulation, and it's the specification of those rules which makes the difference. So it's really about what the book calls class-based power relations. And that's the difference. And unlike markets, this cuts right through the liberal tradition. So we have Locke, Smith, and Mill on one side, but Malthus, Jeremy Bentham, and modern classical liberals such as Nozick, Hayek, and Friedman on the other side. So this is a very powerful counter-narrative to the libertarian reading of liberalism, in which libertarianism is the true heir of classical liberals. And this story clearly suggests otherwise, and I thought that was, I think that is a great contribution. However, this book's dividing lines are also different from classical conservative accounts. For instance, in Russell Kirk's famous The Conservative Mind, Burke is cast as the founding hero, and Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are on the other side because of their rationalist bent. So this is also a different account from that one. In this book, remarkably, the line of progressives goes all the way from Marx to Locke, which is the libertarian founding father in Nozick's reading. So this is an encompassing list of heroes indeed, despite the flaws and dark sides that many of these characters had and which the book rightly criticizes. But I think it's very interesting how it redraws the cast of characters and on which side they're on. This reading of the history of the Protestant work ethic, I think also provides conceptual tools for understanding social democracy as a marriage or joint product of socialism and liberalism. Now, many might think this has been done before, that this is obvious, but I think that most of us, when we think about that marriage, we think about the marriage of economic socialism with political liberalism, that what we're talking about is that liberalism contributed individual rights, and that social democracy is really just socialism accepting democracy. But according to this account, that's not quite right, because many of the economic measures proposed by classical liberals very early on were quite consistent with the social democratic agenda, including social insurance by Thomas Paine, if I remember rightly, in the 1790s, public education by Adam Smith, land reform, and many others. So it's not quite the usual reading where liberalism just supplies individual rights and nothing more. This book also has many normative and practical implications, which I think were very, very interesting. It provides, Elizabeth just discussed this in terms of in her presentation, but some of the secularized progressive Protestant ethic recommends some things that I think that perhaps we all know, but we might tend to forget a bit. Ideas such as that the institutional arrangements must benefit all, as against the utilitarian belief in mere aggregate utility as a standard. The idea that businesses contribute to the public good by creating value rather than just transferring it or extracting it from others. And that business models that fail this test ought to be criticized and confronted. The critique of the idle rich and of all those who violate what we might call some test of reciprocity, whereby we're entitled to society's help, provided that we do our duties to society. For instance, in many countries, welfare fraud is much more salient than tax fraud. I'm not sure that's the case in Chile. I think we're quite keen on tax fraud, and it gets a lot of coverage. But it is true that these being two ways of violating norms of reciprocity, they in many times they get quite unequal treatment. And the book, I think, makes a powerful call for many things. Most of all, reevaluation, reimagination of social democracy, an enlargement of our policy imagination in terms of thinking big, like classical liberals did, in terms of how to improve institutional arrangements. It also calls for an economics profession more sensitive to a wider range of normative issues than just efficiency and distribution. Notably, the consequences of policy decisions for class power, which is a point that Acemoglu and Robinson also made in a paper some time ago, and for the nature of work, to think about the nature of work and regarding the degree of autonomy and self-realization that different modes of organizing work can provide. And ultimately, that the point is not economic growth per se, but people's capabilities, virtues, and social relations. And these issues, I think, thinking about the economic system in terms of what it does to us, our capabilities, virtues, and social relations, is particularly relevant now that artificial intelligence is poised to profoundly transform the workplace, this time particularly of cognitive workers, mostly in routine jobs, which could either open the door to further forms of commodification and de-skilling of professional work, or perhaps to more autonomous and meaningful ones. So in short, I would certainly recommend this book to all who want to think about large questions about the organization of our economic life from a historically and philosophically informed perspective. Now, to finish, I want to suggest some questions and observations that I think to get the discussion going. One is about the book clearly calls for some sort of recovery of social democracy. But I would wonder, why did social democracy fail in the 1970s, or at least why did neoliberalism win? I'm curious if you think that those reasons were mainly internal, such as starting to believe in meritocracy rather than final outcomes, as you briefly mentioned in the book, or were they more external? Was it about stagflation, low growth, and policy failure in some sense? Secondly, I thought that the final chapter, and particularly the one on neoliberalism, elide to some degree the conservative work ethic and neoliberalism as an ideology with distinct policy prescriptions. Now, they clearly have elective affinity. They tend to go together, perhaps nowhere more so than in the United States. But I wonder if they can be if they're fully interchangeable. For instance, it seems to me that it is one thing to say that the suspicion of the poor informs neoliberals' workfare policies, so that the secularized conservative work ethic is still operating there in the suspicion of the poor. We want to avoid welfare fraud and so forth. But it is rather another to argue that neoliberalism's critique of bureaucracy, as for instance in public choice theory, or the evils of overregulation, even perhaps the promotion of privatization of state enterprises under some circumstances, that all of this was mainly informed by the conservative work ethic. Indeed, the book itself discusses some neoliberal policy successes and discusses why privatization might work in some cases and not in others. For this, it relies on the theory of the firm, and it argues that healthcare, prisons are really bad ideas for privatization. But all of that discussion can be had without particular reference to the work ethic. So I think sometimes perhaps we're just laying too much at the Protestant ethics door. Thirdly, I got a sense that there's a fundamental asymmetry between the two sides here. Now, in terms of the Protestant work ethic, I think that's very clear. As you just explained, there's the full interpretation of it clearly demands work from both the rich and the poor, so it's symmetrical in that sense. And it's hijacking, and that's the name of the book, is because one side says, oh, actually, only this only applies to the poor, right? So that asymmetry is there. But does this translate directly into the contrast between social democracy and neoliberalism? The way social democracy is discussed in the book is as a transcendence of the workers' interest, because social democrats realized they needed more people to win. So instead of defending merely workers' interests, they cared about citizenship rights. So it has a sort of universal standpoint. On the other hand, neoliberalism seems to be just the defense of the rich and of institutional solutions that favor their power. So it sounds a bit like we have a politics where there are on one side the good guys that care about universal interests and the bad guys that only care about class interests. Is this an accurate reading? I just think about Hayek's defense of markets as conveyors of information, some of Friedman's proposals, for instance, a negative income tax, which seems a pretty dignified way of getting workers the income they deserve. I mean, at least some of those things don't seem to me to be fully equatable with just a defense of class interests. So I wonder about that. And finally, and this is my last point because I wasn't measuring myself. I hope I'm not taking too long. I wonder what you think about how this applies to the immediate periphery, we might call it, of Protestant countries, notably Catholic countries such as France, Spain, and some at least in Latin America. I think here Chile might be a really interesting example because of the influence of the Chicago Boys, but it's a very Catholic country, so we had very Catholic Chicago Boys. For instance, Miguel Cast was a Chicago boy. He was planning ministry, and the social policies he planned were, you could say, and you know, Pinochet's whole program in terms of social policy reads very much along neoliberal lines. But on the other hand, Miguel Cast reputedly cared deeply about the poor, and he's under. I think he's the one who created the extreme poverty maps, like sort of Charles Booth in London in the 1890s. He was the one who commanded that in the 1970s in Chile. To be able to focus resources on the very poor. So it's a bit of a paradox because on the one hand, there was a lower social spending. There was economic crisis as well, but a lot of subsidies got taken away from the middle class, but perhaps they were better focused on the very poor. In Latin America, we have a lot of this. For instance, higher education subsidies are huge, but primary education coverage is paltry. So it seems that actually focusing on the very poor is not so bad after all under those circumstances, but it does preserve class distinctions. This is not social democracy by any means. So it's a Catholic version of neoliberalism, which might be less punitive to the poor, but still preserving class distinctions. I don't know. I thought that was an interesting contrast to think about how this applies in Catholic countries that perhaps don't have this suspicion of the poor. It's not so deeply ingrained. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to reply? And the rest, if they can write their questions in the Q&A or raise your hands in the app. Do you want to answer?
Oh, just very quickly. The triumph of neoliberalism, I think, ideologically was triggered by the stagflation of the 1970s, which convinced a lot of people, including voters, that maybe there was something wrong with all this government spending and so forth. Certainly in the United States, it was very powerful. But that enabled neoliberals then to lock in various international agreements, which pretty much forced, trade agreements in particular, that pretty much forced neoliberal policy on a global level in ways that also undermined the social democracies in Europe, particularly the lack of capital controls on international currency flows has been pretty devastating to a lot of economies due to the wild speculation in financial markets. So I do think there's closer parallels perhaps in the United States to the original Protestant work ethic in its conservative version and what we have today in the United States. For instance, the arguments for dismantling social welfare benefits under the Clinton administration are basically just repeats of what Malthus said back in the day. Milton Friedman is an interesting exception, I think, to most neoliberals in that he really did care about the poor. But even that, a recent biography shows that as he joined forces with other neoliberals, he stepped back from the negative income tax and similar pretty interesting policies because they didn't want any redistribution of wealth downward. And finally, I appreciate your both your summary of my book and your pointing out that traditions are quite different in dominant Catholic countries, and I'd love to learn more about that. The Catholics were never as obsessed with work and asceticism as Protestants have been historically, and those cultural differences can manifest today in different types of policy. And I agree with you also that in countries where poverty is extreme and government spending has been focused on almost exclusively on helping the middle class, that it is time to pay more attention to the poor. I agree with that.
So Salvador Valdez has a question. He says, like, we're starting with the Protestants and religious thinkers of the 16th century. So why are they so special that we should really look at them? Like, isn't there they live in a very special situation, right? Where a lot of revolutions were happening. So why do you think it's so important to look at them?
Well, I mean, the revolutionary aspect is a very important feature of many of these Puritans. Richard Baxter himself marched with the Parliamentary Army during the English Civil War. It's a very anti-monarchical position. And the Puritans were harshly critical of the aristocracy because they're idle rich who are just living off the labor of the peasants who are working their land. It's definitely coming from a certain class position, not necessarily of ordinary workers, but you could see, I mean, to a large extent on behalf of those workers, I would say. And that is so you can locate the origins of a more progressive attitude towards workers right there, especially the egalitarianism of occupations. The Puritans insisted that it doesn't matter whether you are a fancy ambassador or a street sweeper. From God's point of view, both occupations have their own dignity and have to be honored because they're performing socially necessary work.
If anyone has another question, I have two questions. One is like, if you think we should focus on policies on the very rich, for example. Well, because I studied at Stanford, I see a lot of these people from Silicon Valley that like they become millionaires and they're 43 years old or something, and they stop working, right? Because they have kind of achieved heaven in earth. They're just go around the world. They live out of the rents or whatever. Do you think there should be a special tax on that, and also on consumption, leisure consumption, right? Like people that buy jets, helicopters, particular items, even American football teams or whatever. It's like a form of consumption that is particular of the rich and maybe particular of the idle rich, right? And
oh, absolutely, yeah.
The other one is kind of a silly question, which is like, do you agree or do you like the word neoliberal in the sense that has that word been hijacked? Like, if you were in 1950 and you hear the word neoliberal, maybe you will think of the tradition that Daniel kind of said, right? Like John Stuart Mill, whatever, they should be the inheritors of that word, right? The new philosophers that follow that line should be the neoliberals. However, we call the neoliberal something of a libertarian or something. Do you think that word has kind of been hijacked? Would you prefer that? I know it's a tag now and it's hard to change, but doesn't it have like is kind of hijacking a tradition in a way? That's my.
Oh, I see. Yes. So neoliberalism, I think, presents a false understanding of classical liberalism. The neoliberals claim to be following classical liberals such as Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and John Locke. But as I argue, and thank you, Daniel, for highlighting this, what these people actually said was rather different from what neoliberals today believe. And in particular, John Stuart Mill was very aggressive about redistributing property and land to the people who actually worked it. He's a very Lockean fellow, which is not widely, understood. But he advocated very powerful land reform, especially in Ireland, but even in England as well.
So a student has a question similar to what Daniel asked you. Like he says, like basically, if you think about Chile, we're a very small country, right? We're fully integrated with the world. We have treaties with trade treaties with almost everyone. So
yeah,
in a way, do we have a real option to opt out to a different model that gives a higher priority to workers, or we're really like so tied with neoliberalism that there is no way out?
Well, I do think that there is some momentum for rethinking some of these global trade agreements that give enormous power to foreign investors to veto domestic reforms such as higher minimum wages or regulations of factories and so forth on behalf of workers, claiming that this is losing them profits that were a predicate for them to invest in the first place. I think actually there's much more skepticism these days about that version of free trade, which gives everything to the investors. And also climate change is going to force, I think, some changes in international agreements. This is really a climate emergency. It's going to require the cooperation of all countries to solve. And that too, I think, will inevitably lead to alterations in trade agreements, in particular penalties on carbon-intensive production. You have to give some kind of incentive for firms to reduce their carbon footprint. And I think that provides productive openings for small countries as well as big ones to renegotiate the terms of international trade agreements so that the small countries aren't trapped in a position where they're exploited by these huge corporations.
Okay, I think we have another question, but it's more about another question that wants to explain the book, but I think it's kind of difficult to ask. Someone is worried about like wage differences between for-profit and non-profit organizations. In a way, there is something about, I don't know if taste or what you will call it, that how we can, a lot of people want to work in non-profit organizations that have a meaning, as the progressive ethic will say, that add value to society. But however, we see a very large gap of wages between, say, the venture capital
absolutely
capitals and the people that do this kind of stuff. So do you have any idea how we solve that, how we think about that, or like, I don't know, like?
Well, I'm a believer in steep progressive income taxes. I think billionaires are, why should we even have billionaires? My main worry about billionaires is exactly John Rawls's. He was my dissertation advisor, and he argued, I think accurately, that once inequality of wealth gets too high, the rich capture the political process, and you lose your democracy. And that's an old concern. Rousseau had exactly the same concern. And I think wage compression is very important, especially at the very top. Elon Musk should not have $200 billion. But it's very hard to climb down from that because the rich have enormous clout in lobbying and lawmaking. But we had to figure out some way to do that.
Okay, that's great. I think that will be all. Thank you so much for your presentation. To everyone, when I send you the invitation, I included a link to the book in case you want to order it. And thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you,
And
Danielle.
thank you, Daniel, for your wonderful summary of my book. It's really fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a very interesting talk.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye.